On the day I discovered I wasn't allowed to stand beside my son at the altar, I was holding the receipt confirming a transfer of $58,000 that I had just sent to pay for his entire wedding. I stood in the silent kitchen. The late afternoon sunlight spilled through the window above the sink. It was the very window Sylvia, my wife, had insisted on installing. She wanted to look out at the rose bushes in the backyard while she cleaned. Now Sylvia was gone. It was just me, the steady ticking of the wall clock, and the receipt that was still warm from the printer. The phone on the table began to vibrate. It was Nadine, my future daughter-in-law. Her voice was syrupy sweet, the kind of sweetness that usually appeared whenever she needed another check. But today the tone was different. Colder. Calculated. Nadine started talking about symmetry, about the aesthetics of a perfect wedding. She explained that her parents were people of status, tall, elegant, perfectly matched in photographs, and me, a retired engineer with age spots on his hands. A man who, in her words, simply didn't fit the flawless image she had designed. She told me I wouldn't be allowed at the rehearsal dinner. Worse, I was being replaced in the role of walking my son down the aisle. The reason was simple photo symmetry. They had already found some distant uncle of hers to play the role of the perfect father. I tightened my grip on the receipt. My fingers trembled. As a mechanical engineer, I had spent 40 years designing structures built to bear weight. I understand stability. I know when a foundation begins to crack. But this fracture wasn't in a blueprint. It was inside my chest. A sharp pain cut through the quiet sacrifices of a father. I said nothing. My silence lasted so long, Nadine finally asked if I was still on the line. The silence of an engineer usually means he's evaluating the extent of the damage. $58,000. It wasn't just money. It was sweat. Sacrifice. The savings Sylvia and I had built over years so our son could have a good start in life. And yet somehow my presence had become a flaw in their wedding photographs. I looked down at my hands, thin, awkward hands. Joints worn from a lifetime spent building futures for other people. Nadine hung up after tossing out a shallow apology. The kitchen fell back into that terrifying silence. The receipt for $58,000 slipped from my fingers and landed alone on the cold stone countertop. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a glass of water, maybe a snack, sit back and get comfortable. And remember, everyone in these stories had every chance to do the right thing. They just chose not to. Leave a comment with the name of the city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. I slowly sat down in my chair. My mind began running calculations. Not calculations about machines. Calculations about justice. Because if they saw me as nothing more than a decorative piece that could be replaced, then they should also understand what it costs when the foundation is removed. I stared into the empty space. The chair across from me was still empty. It used to be Sylvia's seat. She would sit there every morning, a cup of coffee in her hand, her eyes resting on the backyard window. Sylvia always said this house was my greatest achievement. Not the bridges or highway systems I had designed, but the love I poured into every brick. In 1986, we got married with just $40 in our pockets. One promise. One cheap silver ring. We didn't need photo symmetry. We only needed each other. Sylvia stood beside me through the hardest years of poverty. She never once asked for a lavish wedding. All she wanted was a home that would stand strong. I remembered Gareth's face when he was little. He always ran to me whenever he fell. I was his safety net. Before Sylvia passed away, I promised her I would always protect him, that I would make sure he never had to suffer. I kept that promise blindly. I turned myself into a pillar that never complained. But now I realize I was wrong. I built his foundation too strong. So strong that he forgot who had been sweating underneath it all. Gareth is no longer the boy who needed my protection. He has become a stranger, a man willing to push his own father aside for the vanity of his future wife. What did Nadine do to my son? Or had Gareth always been this way? The questions drilled deeper and deeper into my mind. I stood up, my legs slightly unsteady. I walked to the sink and touched the wooden window frame. Sylvia loved so much. The paint had begun to peel. Time spares nothing, not even loyalty between family. A deep emptiness settled inside me. $58,000 for the wedding. That number was just the final entry in a long ledger of being used. I remembered Gareth's phone calls. They always started the same way. "Dad, how are you?" And they always ended with a bill that needed paying. A new car, a luxury vacation, a credit card debt. I had been a terrible engineer in my own family. I ignored every warning sign of structural overload. I let love blur the real numbers. Sylvia had warned me once. She said Gareth was becoming too dependent, but I brushed it off. I wanted to make up for the loss of his mother. Now that compensation had become a blade, and it had been driven straight into this old heart. I looked at the receipt on the table. It was no longer a payment confirmation. It was evidence of my foolishness. I opened the cabinet drawer and took out my personal financial records. It was time for a mechanical engineer to conduct a full structural inspection. There would be no room for emotion in these calculations. If my presence held no value at the altar, then my money shouldn't be there either. I picked up a pencil and began drawing straight lines across the paper. Numbers started appearing. Clear, cold, merciless. I would give them the symmetry they wanted. The symmetry between what they received and what they deserved. Gareth had forgotten one fundamental law of physics. When you remove the main support column, the entire structure collapses. And I am that column. A column that has grown tired of carrying the weight for far too long. Tonight I will not sleep. Tonight I will calculate the price of betrayal. Cent by cent. I sat beneath the dim yellow glow of the desk lamp. Numbers began to dance across the paper. It was the habit of a mechanical engineer. When a machine breaks down, you dismantle it piece by piece. You find the fracture point. Tonight that machine was my life. I flipped through the bank transaction history from the past 3 years. A number at the bottom of the page made my breath catch. $97,000. That was the total amount I had spent on Gareth and Nadine. I stared at it. It wasn't just numbers. It was my lifespan. It was the overtime hours I worked while Sylvia was still alive. I began analyzing each entry. $45,000 for the down payment on their condominium. I thought it was the foundation of my son's happiness. $12,000 for Gareth's new car, because he said he needed reliable transportation to get to work. $1,100 for a plumbing repair bill last month. And then I remembered something. That was the same day Nadine posted photos of herself dining at the most expensive steakhouse in the city. They weren't fixing plumbing. They were spending my trust. Every line on the paper felt like another crack spreading through the structure. I turned to the page for the joint account I had opened for Gareth when he first entered college. That's when I noticed a new withdrawal. $5,000. No permission. No message. Not even a courtesy call. They had taken my money to prepare for a wedding where I wasn't even allowed to stand at the altar. Anger began flowing through my veins. Not the kind that shouts, the kind that feels like cold steel in winter. I realized something in that moment. To them I was not a father. I was an ATM machine that never ran out of cash. A safety net they could stomp on whenever they pleased. I remembered Nadine talking about photo symmetry. She worried about the aesthetic perfection of a wedding. But she didn't worry about who paid for every yard of lace on her wedding dress. She didn't care about the rough hands that signed those checks. I picked up my phone. My fingers moved calmly across the screen. I opened the banking app. It took only seconds. Lock the cards. Close the joint account. Cancel every automatic transfer. A strange sense of power ran through me. For the first time in years, I felt like I was controlling the load again. I was no longer a passive structure absorbing pressure. I was redesigning the entire system. I wondered how Gareth would react when his credit card was declined at the wedding florist. I wondered what Nadine would do when she realized the $58,000 wedding payment had never actually gone through. Because that transfer had been pending for 24 hours. And I had just pressed cancel. I leaned back in my chair. The pain in my chest was still there. But clarity had returned. In engineering, when a component stops functioning properly, you remove it. Gareth had chosen to remove my place at the altar. So I removed my place from their list of sponsors. Nadine's game of symmetry was about to begin. But she was about to learn the real meaning of balance between desire and the ability to pay for it herself. I looked at the final balance sheet one last time. $97,000. That was the price of my awakening. Far too expensive, but worth it. I switched off the desk lamp. Darkness filled the room. But this time I wasn't afraid. I was waiting. I knew the phone would ring soon. And this time, I would be the one setting the terms. Just as I expected, the phone began vibrating violently on the wooden table. The screen showed Gareth's name. I didn't rush to answer. I let it ring until the very last tone. Silence is a form of pressure. I learned that while testing material strength. The one who rushes, loses. I finally picked up. Chaos exploded through the speaker. Gareth was breathing hard. He was at the wedding suit shop. His card had been declined. The staff were staring at him with suspicion. He demanded to know what was going on. He shouted that this had to be some terrible mistake. I took a slow breath. My voice came out so calm it surprised even me. There's no mistake, I told him. I closed the account, and I canceled the transfer of $58,000. A dead silence followed on the line. Gareth stammered. Why? I repeated Nadine's favorite word. Symmetry. I told him that if I wasn't worthy enough to stand at the altar, then my money wasn't worthy enough to sit in the restaurant's bank account. Perfect symmetry. Exactly the way his fiancée wanted. Gareth's tone changed instantly. The pleading disappeared. What replaced it was a cowardly anger. He called me petty. Said I was ruining the most important day of his life because of my oversized ego. He used uglier words too. He said I was a terrible father. Terrible. I looked down at the list in front of me. $97,000. I asked him about the plumbing repair from last month. I asked about the car he was driving. I asked about the condominium I had helped build the foundation for. Gareth fell silent. He had no answers. Only attacks. He accused me of being selfish. Said money mattered more to me than the bond between father and son. I gave a quiet, painful laugh. I had spent 30 years proving the opposite. And what did it earn me? A revoked invitation. A cheap replacement in the one place I should have been proudest to stand. Then I heard Nadine's voice in the background. She was shouting at Gareth, talking about her family's reputation, talking about how their friends would laugh if the wedding collapsed. Not one of them asked how I felt. They were only worried about their perfect picture falling apart. Gareth made a threat. If you don't reopen the account, he said, I'll never speak to you again. I'll consider you gone. Just like Mom. That sentence hit like a brutal punch to the ribs. My chest tightened, but I didn't break. My voice turned cold. When a structure cracks too deeply, I said you don't repair it with threats. If you're mature enough to remove your father from your wedding, then you're mature enough to pay for it yourself. And then I hung up. My hand was still shaking, but my heart had turned cold. I looked at Sylvia's photograph and whispered an apology. I couldn't protect the son we loved. Greed and selfishness had swallowed him whole. But I knew this was only the beginning. When parasites lose their source of nourishment, they become desperate. But I'm an engineer. I know how to build barriers. I know how to protect what remains of my life. I stood and walked to the window. Night had settled over the backyard. Sylvia's rose bushes trembled softly in the wind. And suddenly a thought crossed my mind. What if there were more secrets I didn't know? What if Sylvia had left something behind? Something I had overlooked all these years. I had a strange feeling. Somewhere in this house there was a truth waiting to be found. I stepped into the old bedroom. Sylvia's scent still lingered faintly on the curtains. I walked toward the oak wardrobe, the place where she kept the keepsakes I rarely touched. I needed answers. I needed to know just how blind I had been. At the bottom of a small wooden box lay a brown leather notebook. Sylvia's diary. Her neat slanted handwriting appeared under the beam of my flashlight. I began to read. Every page felt like a hammer striking the last piece of patience I had left. She had written about Nadine 4 years earlier when Gareth first brought her home. Sylvia had seen what I refused to see. She wrote that Nadine didn't look at Gareth with love in her eyes. She looked at this house. She looked at the expensive furniture. She looked at our savings account the way a hunter studies its prey. Sylvia had even written down a conversation she overheard by accident. Nadine told Gareth that I was nothing more than a tool. A way for them to reach a luxurious life without effort. And Gareth had stayed silent. He didn't defend me. He didn't defend his mother, who was already sick at the time. The pain tightened inside my chest. A brutal truth. Sylvia had known everything. She carried that burden alone because she didn't want me to collapse under it. She hoped time would change our son. But she was wrong. My tolerance only fed their greed. The final page of the diary stopped me cold. Sylvia had written it 1 week before she died. She begged me to stay awake, to stay clear-minded. She wrote that if there ever came a day when I felt I was no longer respected, I must stop. I must protect what was ours, and never allow them to drain the life out of me and discard me like an empty shell. I closed the diary. Hot tears rolled down my wrinkled cheeks. I had been too weak. I mistook submission for love. I allowed Gareth and Nadine to trample Sylvia's legacy. Just then a message arrived. From Gareth. It was a screenshot of a legal complaint. He threatened to sue me for violating a wedding sponsorship agreement. He demanded $25,000 in compensation for additional costs and for Nadine's emotional distress. I laughed through my tears. The son I raised was suing his own father, right after I had finished reading his mother's warnings. The irony was almost cruel. He wanted a war, fine. He wanted calculations like strangers. Then I would show him how a real engineer handles numbers. I looked into the mirror. For the first time tonight, I didn't see a pitiful old man abandoned by his family. I saw a man who had found his footing again. I would not stop at cutting off their funding. I would reclaim every dollar they had taken from me and Sylvia. A contract. In engineering, a contract becomes invalid the moment fraud exists in the foundation. And their marriage was the greatest fraud I had ever seen. I picked up the phone. It was time to call an old friend, attorney Gloria Harmon. I had thought the greatest pain was being pushed out of my son's wedding, but I was wrong. The real blow was still coming. I would tear off their masks in the very place where they planned to hold their extravagant ceremony. I left the bedroom. My steps were steadier now than they had been in years. I was no longer walking in the darkness of deception. I was moving toward the light of justice, a cold kind of justice, one that leaves no room for mercy. If you feel this story is heading in the right direction, leave a comment below saying I stand with Leonard. Your support is what keeps me uncovering the truth. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. The next morning, the doorbell rang again and again. I opened the door. A man in a cheap suit handed me a yellow envelope. A lawsuit. Gareth had actually done it. He was suing his own father for violating a honeymoon agreement and wedding preparation costs. $25,000. That was the number he had placed on this betrayal. I stood frozen on the porch. The paper in my hands trembled not from fear but from disgust. A son suing his father because the money had stopped flowing into his vanity. This was the lowest form of decay I had ever witnessed. I called Gloria Harmon. She had been Sylvia's closest friend, a tough attorney with 30 years of experience in family law. We met at a small cafe. I placed Sylvia's diary and a copy of the lawsuit on the table. Gloria read slowly. Her eyebrows rose slightly. She looked at me with a mix of sympathy and sharp professional focus. This isn't just a civil dispute, she said. This is financial elder abuse. Cold legal words for a deeply immoral act. She began to break it down piece by piece. Gareth and Nadine had a calculated strategy. They took advantage of my emotional weakness after Sylvia died. They withdrew money from the joint account without consent for personal luxuries. They lied about home repairs to obtain cash. Gloria's voice became firm. We won't just defend ourselves, she said. We're going to counterattack. We would collect every piece of evidence showing the misuse of my funds, every message, every receipt, every debt I had unknowingly carried for them. A surge of energy ran through my spine. An engineer understands something simple. When a component fails completely, you don't repair it. You remove it to save the system. Gareth had become a failed component, corroded by Nadine's greed. Gloria told me to remain silent. No answering calls. No replying to messages. Let her handle everything. But my chest still tightened. I remembered Gareth as a boy. I taught him how to assemble model airplanes. I taught him that honesty was the foundation of every structure. Now he was using what I had given him as a weapon against me. He wanted $25,000. He would receive something far greater. He would receive the truth exposed in a courtroom. He would receive the lesson I had been too soft to teach him years ago. Then an email arrived from Nadine. She wrote that if I signed the check, she would persuade Gareth to withdraw the lawsuit. She called it a peaceful reconciliation. She still believed she held the leverage. She still believed I was a confused old man she could manipulate. I didn't respond. I deleted the email immediately. Outside the cafe window, the city moved on as usual. But inside me, there was a terrifying calm. The calm before the greatest storm of my life. I stepped outside. Cold wind pushed against my coat. I once thought the worst pain was being thrown out of my son's wedding. I was wrong. The real blow was still ahead. A courtroom battle where family love would be weighed and measured like numbers on a ledger. And I was ready. For Sylvia. And for my own dignity. I returned home and began gathering documents, blueprints, bank statements, receipts, every number. Gareth had forgotten one important thing. I am an engineer, and I never build anything without a backup plan. My backup plan was about to become their worst nightmare. Gloria's office sat on the top floor of an old building. The air carried the heavy smell of aged paper and printer ink. She looked at me over a pair of silver-rimmed glasses. Gloria didn't comfort me with empty words. Instead, she asked a cold question. "Leonard, do you want to get everything back?" I nodded. It was no longer about money. It was about the integrity of a lifetime of honest work. Gloria opened the financial file I had prepared. She took a yellow highlighter and began marking lines. Bright streaks appeared across the pages like wounds. She pointed at the $1,100 plumbing repair. Then she placed another document beside it. "This," she said, "is a receipt from a luxury spa on the exact same day." Nadine had used the excuse of home repairs to pay for beauty treatments. Next came Gareth's credit card debt. $15,000 for a golf trip in Florida that he had claimed was a business trip. Gloria's voice sharpened. "This is systematic asset exploitation." She called it financial elder abuse. The phrase tasted bitter in my ears. I had never thought of myself as a victim. I believed I was simply a generous father. But Gloria stripped the illusion away. I had been a hostage to my own kindness. She began outlining the strategy. "We won't just dismiss Gareth's lawsuit," she said. "We will countersue. We would demand the return of the condominium down payment. We would demand repayment for the car. And we would ask the court to freeze their assets to guarantee enforcement." A chill ran down my spine. If we did this, Gareth would lose everything. No apartment, no car, and certainly no wedding. Part of me hesitated. He was still my son. He carried Sylvia's blood. Gloria seemed to read my thoughts. She placed her hand firmly on the file. "Leonard," she said quietly, "remember his face when he told you that you didn't belong at the altar. Remember the $25,000 lawsuit he sent you this morning. He stopped seeing you as his father a long time ago." I closed my eyes. I saw Gareth standing beside Nadine. Their expressions were calculating. No regret, only greed. I opened my eyes again. The hesitation was gone. "Proceed," I told Gloria. "Don't hold back." She smiled. It was the smile of a hunter who had finally spotted the prey. Gloria told me she had already hired a private investigator. We needed proof that Nadine had planned this from the beginning. Hidden conversations. Quiet agreements. I left the law office. The city below looked small from that height. My life felt small too. I had spent too many years building structures for other people. I had forgotten to protect the foundation of my own life. The counterclaim would be filed tomorrow morning. Gareth would receive it while trying on his expensive wedding suit. I wanted him to understand the feeling of a structure collapsing without warning. No alarms, no escape. I went home and started cleaning. I packed Gareth's old belongings into cardboard boxes. I would no longer keep them where I could see them. I needed space to breathe. I needed a new beginning. But I knew Gareth wouldn't stay silent. He would fight like a cornered animal. And I was ready. I was no longer a weak old father. I was an engineer repairing a catastrophic system failure. A system failure named my only son. Early on the morning of the wedding, I put on my best suit. The suit I had bought specifically for the day I would walk Gareth down the aisle. I wasn't going there to beg for forgiveness. I was going to perform one final inspection. The lobby of the five-star hotel was thick with the scent of lilies and luxury. I stood outside the bridal suite entrance, Two security guards looked at me with polite pity. They told me my name was not on the guest list. They said the bride had requested that I leave. Gareth stepped out. He was wearing the custom suit I had paid the first installment for. His face twisted with anger. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. He called me a saboteur. He said I had humiliated him in front of Nadine's family by filing the counterclaim. Nadine appeared right behind him. She was radiant in a white lace wedding dress, but her eyes were full of poison. She called me a crazy old man. She threatened to call the police if I took another step. She said my presence would stain their perfect day. I looked directly into my son's eyes. I asked him only one question. "Gareth, do you really want this?" He didn't answer. He only shouted for me to leave. He said I was no longer his father. He said my love had always been cheap control. The pain in my chest suddenly disappeared. In its place was a perfect emptiness, like a steel beam finally snapping after years of carrying too much weight. The structure had completely collapsed. There was nothing left here to repair. I stepped back. Then I pulled out a small envelope. I didn't hand it to Gareth. I gave it to the security guard. "Please give this to the groom after I leave," I said. Inside was documentation showing that their condominium had been legally frozen. It was also the notice for the repossession of the car later that afternoon. Nadine laughed. She thought I was bluffing. She believed her power was permanent. She didn't know how efficiently Gloria had been working. She didn't know that the luxury surrounding her was nothing more than a castle built on sand. I turned and walked away. Inside the ballroom, orchestral music began to rise. The laughter of wealthy guests drowned out the sound of my footsteps. I walked out of the hotel into the bright sunlight. I sat in my car and looked into the rearview mirror. Gareth was standing at the entrance. He was staring at me with confusion on his face. Perhaps he had finally begun to feel the shaking beneath the foundation. But it was too late for reinforcement. My silence over the past days had been technical preparation. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I simply removed the financial supports they had always relied on. If they wanted a wedding built on photo symmetry, then they would receive a reality perfectly symmetrical to their actions. I drove away. I didn't go home. I drove to the cemetery. I needed to speak with Sylvia. I needed to tell her that I had followed her advice. I had drawn the boundary. I had found myself again in the ruins of a broken family. The court battle would take place next week. But for me, the war ended at the doorway of that hotel. I had seen the truth. And the truth had freed me from the chains of meaningless sacrifice. If you followed the story all the way here, then it must have held your interest. So here's a small and quick favor, press subscribe. Many people watch without doing it, but it costs nothing and means a great deal to us. I took a deep breath. The air filled my lungs. For the first time in years, I didn't feel heavy. I didn't feel anxious. I only felt the freedom of a man who had nothing left to lose. The wedding would continue, but their future would not. A new chapter of my life was beginning. Without Gareth. Without Nadine. Just me. And the hard lessons that finally set me free. The courtroom felt cold. The scent of polished wood and solemn silence filled the air. I sat on the left side of the room. Gloria Harmon was beside me, organizing thick stacks of documents. Across the aisle sat Gareth and Nadine. Gareth no longer wore the elegant suit from the wedding day. He looked pale and worn out. Nadine sat next to him, gripping her designer handbag as if it were the last thing she still controlled. Nadine began with a performance worthy of a stage. She sniffled before the judge, speaking about emotional suffering. She described me as a bitter father who had ruined the happiest day of their lives. She demanded $25,000 in damages for breaking my promise to fund their wedding. She played the victim beautifully. But she forgot one important thing. Judges do not rule based on tears. They rule based on evidence. Gloria stood. She didn't use dramatic language. She simply presented numbers. Cold, undeniable numbers. $97,000 over the past 3 years. She exposed every fraudulent expense. The plumbing repair that was actually a spa bill. The work equipment purchase that turned out to be a luxury vacation. The decisive blow came when Stewart entered the courtroom. He was Gareth's old friend, and once my assistant. In his hands was a folder containing voice recordings and text messages. Gareth had accidentally sent part of a conversation to an old group chat. In the recording, Nadine laughed about draining my accounts after the wedding and moving into a new apartment under her name alone. Gareth had replied with a simple approval emoji. Silence spread through the courtroom. I looked at my son. His head hung low. There was no remorse in his face, only the humiliation of being caught. I asked permission to speak. I stood up. My hands were no longer shaking. I looked directly at the judge. I spoke the way an engineer would. Your Honor, I said in construction, we call this material fatigue. I carried the load of love for many years. But this is not a child asking for support. This is calculated exploitation disguised as family. I did not violate any contract, because a contract built on deception at its foundation never truly exists. The judge turned to Gareth. Do you have anything to say? He stammered. Then he tried to blame Nadine. He claimed she had pressured him. Nadine shot him a look filled with disgust. The perfect photosymmetry they once dreamed of had turned into a fracture exploding right before everyone's eyes. The ruling came shortly after. The judge dismissed Gareth's lawsuit entirely. She declared the situation a clear case of financial elder abuse. Gareth was ordered to repay the full apartment deposit and my legal fees. The court also instructed Adult Protective Services to investigate additional financial exploitation. Gareth collapsed back into his chair. Nadine stood abruptly and walked out of the courtroom without even looking at him. I looked at my son one last time. I felt no triumph, only the sight of a structure completely destroyed, a ruin that could never be rebuilt. I walked out of the courthouse. Gloria shook my hand and told me it was finally over. But I knew something every engineer understands. Demolition is not the hardest part. Rebuilding from the ashes is. I took a deep breath. The air outside the courthouse felt clean. For the first time in years, I owed nothing to anyone, and no one could take anything more from me. Justice had been served, but the price was a family, gone forever. I decided to sell the old house. There were too many ghosts of betrayal living in those walls. I moved into a small apartment overlooking the river. The space was simple and filled with light. Most of my time now was spent in a small woodworking shop in the basement. The sound of the saw and the scent of fresh pine helped me find my calm again. I was no longer calculating thousands of dollars. Now I measured the precision of each wood joint. Nadine left immediately after the court ruling. She could not survive without my checks. She took what little luxury remained and abandoned Gareth with a mountain of debt. Their condominium was repossessed. The car was taken back. Gareth was left with nothing. No money, no status, no family. One night at 2 a.m, my phone vibrated. It was Gareth. He was crying. His voice broke between sobs and the thick smell of alcohol. He said he was sorry. He said Nadine had manipulated him. He begged me to give him a chance to come back. He promised he would start over. He said he had nowhere left to go. I listened in silence. My heart no longer tightened the way it once did. The load I had carried for years had already reached its breaking point. Now it had simply hardened. I told him the door of my home would never close to my son. But my son had disappeared from my life on the day of that wedding. The man speaking to me now was only a stranger learning to face the consequences of his choices. I did not give him money. I gave him an address. A woodworking shop outside the city. If he truly wanted to start again, he would have to begin with labor. He would have to learn how to build something with his own sweat instead of draining it from others. 1 month later, Gareth appeared at my door. He looked thinner. The hands that once signed checks were now covered in calluses and small cuts. He asked if he could help me build a bookshelf for the living room. I handed him a hand plane. He worked clumsily. He mismeasured boards. He ruined a few pieces of good wood. But for the first time I saw persistence in him. He did not complain. He did not demand anything. He simply bent down and quietly gathered the wood shavings from the floor. Forgiveness is a complicated form of engineering. You cannot simply cover the cracks. You must dismantle the rotten pieces and rebuild the structure properly. Gareth and I are only at the first step of that process. We no longer talk about money. We talk about wood grain, about balance, about how a structure holds its weight. Watching my son struggle with the sanding machine, I realized something. My greatest mistake had not been giving him money. It was failing to teach him how to stand on his own feet. I had built him such a wide safety net that he forgot how to fly. My new life is quiet. Each afternoon I sit on the balcony and watch the river flow past. I no longer feel lonely. Somewhere I believe Sylvia is smiling. I protected the foundation of my own life. If any part of this story feels familiar to you, if you feel that people only need you but never truly respect you, then listen carefully. You are allowed to stop. Setting boundaries is not cruelty. Sometimes it is the only way to discover who truly cares about you. My story may not end with great wealth or a perfectly reunited family. But I have freedom. Gareth has a chance to become a real man. And that is the final balance sheet I am most satisfied with. Thank you for following Leonard's journey toward justice here on Dad's Real Life Revenge. Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next hard-earned lessons. See you in the next story.